Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah shiur. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav, and we will be learning today Mir Hashem Daf Kuf Lamed Amid Beis and a piece of Kuf Lamed Aleph Amid Aleph as well. So we're in the middle of a Siman that I find to be a very fascinating Siman Tuf Reish Nun Ches, which is the dinim of the Daled Minim on the first day of Yom Tov. And let's remember again the great distinction between the first day of Yom Tov and the rest of Yom Tov when it comes to the Daled Minim is that the mitzvah saseh of taking the Daled Minim on the first day of Yom Tov is a mitzvah da'araisa, even outside of the Beis HaMikdash. In the Beis HaMikdash, there's a mitzvah da'araisa called Shiva to take the Daled Minim every day of Yom Tov. Outside the precincts of the Beis HaMikdash, we only have a mitzvah da'araisa on day one. The rest of Yom Tov is only a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. After the Churban, the Chazal were misakin that we should take the Daled Minim all the days of Yom Tov as a zecher to the Mikdash. So the first day is d'Araisa, the rest of Yom Tov is d'Rabbanan. We had a very fascinating discussion about what the halacha is in the Ir HaAtika of Yerushalayim. We saw that according to the Rambam, it's possible that there's a mitzvah da'araisa even nowadays in the Ir HaAtika of Yerushalayim. But for the most part, we assume that the mitzvah on the first day is da'araisa, the rest of Yom Tov is only a d'Rabbanan. Now, one of the ramifications of that is that on the first day of Yom Tov, there's a requirement of lachem. In order for you to be mekayim the mitzvah of Daled Minim, you have to use Daled Minim that belong to you. If you don't have Daled Minim and you want to use somebody else's Daled Minim, you can't use them and be yaitza the mitzvah if he only lends them to you, because then they're not yours. They belong to him. He lent them to you. You cannot be mekayim the mitzvah with borrowed Daled Minim, because that is not lachem. It's not yours. So we saw in yesterday's shiur on Kuf Lamed Amid Aleph in Sif Dalet, we saw that a matana al manas lahachzir is effective. If the owner of the Daled Minim gives them to you as a matana, so now they are yours. They are lochem. But it's a matana al manas lahachzir. It's a matana which is conditional. You have to give it back to him. So you take them, he gives them to you b'matana, now they are totally yours, and now you could use them to be mekayim the mitzvah. However, you have to be mekayim the t'nai, the condition of the gift, which is you need to give them back. Now let's understand what's going on over here. Ruvain has a set of Daled Minim, Shimon does not. Shimon wants to use Ruvain's Daled Minim on the first day of Yom Tov to be mekayim the mitzvah. But Shimon has a problem. In order for him to be mekayim the mitzvah, he needs Daled Minim that are lochem. Ruvain is very willing to give his Daled Minim to Shimon, but he doesn't want to give it to him as a matana. He doesn't just want to give it to him as a gift. Now, there could be several reasons for that. First of all, if he gives it to him as a complete gift, maybe Ruvain wasn't yaitza the mitzvah yet. Maybe Ruvain and Shimon are in the Beis Medrash at 6 o'clock in the morning. Shimon wants to daven at a hashkama minyan. Ruvain wants to daven at the 8:30 minyan. So Shimon wants to use Ruvain's Daled Minim on the first day of Yom Tov before Ruvain was mekayim the mitzvah. So Ruvain cannot give away his Daled Minim. If he gives away his Daled Minim, even if he then borrows them from Shimon, he can't be yaitza the mitzvah because Ruvain needs lachem. So Ruvain needs lachem at the 8:30 minyan. Shimon needs lachem at the hashkama minyan at 6:15. So what Ruvain does is he gives them to Shimon as a matana, so that Shimon could be mekayim lachem and be mekayim the mitzvah at the hashkama minyan. But it's a matana al manas lahachzir. Shimon has to give them back to Ruvain so that Ruvain could then be mekayim the mitzvah at the 8:30 minyan, and he could also be mekayim the requirement of lachem. If everything goes as planned, Ruvain gives it to Shimon. Shimon is yaitza the mitzvah. Shimon is yaitza the mitzvah, and then Shimon returns it to Ruvain. So then everything went as planned. Ruvain had them, and he was able to be mekayim the mitzvah with the requirement of lachem at the hashkama minyan. Shimon got it back when Shimon needed them, and Shimon was mekayim the mitzvah, and everything is fine. But if Reuven were to give them to Shimon as a matana amanas lahachzir, and then Shimon fails to return them to Reuven for whatever reason, maybe like we said yesterday, a dog came and ate the esrog. So if Shimon fails to return the daled minim to Shimon, and we saw yesterday he has to return them with enough time on the first day of Yom Tov that Reuven will be able to be mekayim the mitzvah. So by at least a few minutes before Shkia, at the end of the day, Shimon's got to return them to Reuven. If he fails to return them to Reuven, then Shimon was not mekayim the mitzvah because he was not mekayim the t'nai of returning it. Since he wasn't mekayim the condition of the gift was never a gift. Since the gift was never a gift, when Shimon took it, made the bracha and shook, it did the nanuim, it was ineffective because it wasn't lachem. It wasn't his. Now, a very interesting piece of lamdas that we have to realize over here is that Shimon, if everything goes as planned, Shimon is mekayim the mitzvah with these daled minim before he's mekayim tonight, right? Reuven gave them to Shimon as a matana amanas lahachzir. So far, Shimon has not returned it to Reuven. So Shimon wasn't mekayim the tonight yet. Shimon's not going to be mekayim the tonight maybe for another hour, maybe for another 2 hours, maybe for another 5 hours. Maybe he won't return it to Shimon until 10 minutes before Shkia, he won't return it to Reuven until 10 minutes before Shkia, when Reuven still has time to be mekayim the mitzvah. So when Shimon makes the bracha and does the nanuim with this set of daled minim, he was not yet mekayim the t'nai, right? But yet he's mekayim the mitzvah anyway, because right now it's lachem, and you can see in the Sharet Tzion on Daf Kuf Lamed Aben Aleph in Sharet Tzion Ois Katan Tes Vav, where the Chavetz Chaim deals with this, and he says the reason for that is that the t'nai comes with a built-in me'achshav, which is that Reuven gives them to Shimon. He says it's a matana al manas lahachzir, but when you return it to me, it becomes yours retroactively. Me'achshav. It's yours from now, so long as you eventually return it to me. So that's what's going on over here with the matana al manas lahachzir. Now, with all this in mind, we turn to Kof Lamed Amud Beis, to the top line, to the words of the Ramah. The Ramah says, Haga, Umuter loses loy esrig b'matana al menas shelo yagdishenu. Now, yesterday when we spoke about the matana al menas lahachzir, we spoke about a case where the matana was done with a severe limitation. Let's say it was not a matana al menas lahachzir. Let's say it was a matana. I'm giving it to you now so that you could be yoitzi your chiyuv with the daled minim, and after your yoitzi your chiyuv, it automatically reverts back to being mine. So I don't want to count on you having to return it to me. I don't want to do matana gemura al menas lahachzir on the t'nai that you will return it. Now depending on you returning it to me. Instead, I just want to build it in automatically. I'm giving it to you now b'matana, but only for now. Only for right now so that you could be yotze the mitzvah. After you yotze the mitzvah, it automatically reverts to me. We saw that that's no good, because that's a matana l'shah. That's a temporary matana. And we saw, I read to you the rush in Masechta Sukkah. This is such a yesodistic rush. A lot of today's shiur is also to be found in that same rush, Perek Gimel Siman Lamed. If you have time, take out a Sukkah Gemara, learn the rush, Perek Gimel Siman Lamed. But the Rush said that a matana l'shah, a temporary matana, is not a matana. A gift that I'm giving it to you, but it automatically reverts back to my ownership. That means I never gave you anything. That means I lent something to you. That's what's called lending. That's not called a gift. A matana al manas lahachzir is a gift, because I give it to you and it's totally yours. You have to give it back to me ultimately, but it's up to you to give it back to me. If you won't give it back to me, then retroactively the matana will become bottled. It will never be a matana. But it's yours to give back to me. It's not built in automatically. So that's a limitation that we learned about yesterday. Now, that limitation is a fatal limitation. If you try to limit the matana that way, then the recipient cannot be yotze the mitzvah of daled minim with those daled minim, because he can't be mekayim lachem. That's not a true matana. Now the Ramah is talking about a different type of limitation. Now the Ramah is talking about a limitation where I give it as a matana al manas lahachzir, but I also make another condition. I limit what you can do with the daled minim. And the example that the Ramah gives is, umuter losei slai esrig b'matana, I could give you the daled minim, esrig is referring to all the daled minim, with a matana al manas lahachzir, al manas shelo yagdishenu. And I also build in another Tanai. When I give it to you, it's a matana gemura. It's a matana gemura al manas lahachzir. Now, if it's totally yours, then l'chari you could do whatever you want with it. But I'm making another stipulation. You cannot be magdish it. You can't make it hegdish and give it to the Beis HaMikdash. You can't do that. So is that a problem? I limited your bailus. I limited your power over the daled minim. You can't be magdish it. Now, l'chari, that's a limitation in ownership. I'm restricting your ownership. Is that a fatal blow to the matana? Is that a fatal blow to lachem? Maybe now you can't be become the mitzvah because it's not truly lachem. Says the Ramah, no, that's not a problem. Why? This is no worse than a regular matana al manas lahachzir. Now, the Ramah is a little bit vague. What does that mean that it's not worse than a regular matana al manas lahachzir? So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah here, Ois Katan Yud Zayin. Umuter shelo yagdishenu. It is okay if the matana is made with a stipulation that the recipient cannot be magdish it. Says the Chavetz Chaim, what the Ramah wants to say is, if the giver makes a stipulation in the gift, that the recipient cannot be magdish to daled minim, nevertheless heavy matana. That is considered a matana gemura, the efshalotzeis by, and the recipient could use these daled minim that considered lachem, he could be yaitza the mitzvah. Uchid the Mishanh. And the rationale for this is as the Ramah himself is Messiah, as he says. Deloy gara, because this is no worse, mimisha amar, from somebody who says, Amanas taxi reuli. Whenever you make a matana amanas lahachzir, included in that stipulation is that you need to give it back to me. If you give somebody daled minim, I'm sorry, with a matana al manas lahachzir, can he be magdish to daled minim? No. If he's magdish to daled minim, now the daled minim belong to hegdish. If they belong to hegdish, he can't give it back to you. So intrinsic in the t'nai of al manas lahachzir is really a t'nai that you can't be magdish it. So you're already restricting the ownership. When you say that you're giving daled minim to the recipient as a matana al manas lahachzir, automatically you are restricting what the recipient can do with those daled minim. Can he sell them? He can't sell them, because if he sells them, he won't be able to return them to you. If he won't be able to return them to you, then the gift will have never been a gift. So whenever you make a matana al manas lahachzir, you are restricting to a certain extent the bailus of the recipient. He's limited in what he can do, and yet the Gemara says that a matana al manas lahachzir is effective, and the recipient can be become the mitzvah because that's considered lachem. Va'afilu haki hevi matana. It's still considered a matana. Va'ayin bi'ar halacha. He sends us to the lengthy bi'ar halacha here. Dibur hamaskal umuter. Now I'm not going to go through this whole bi'ar halacha, but I am going to read to you just 3 lines from the middle of the bi'ar halacha, where the Chavetz Chaim brings down a Rashbam in Baba Basra. So let's just remember, this concept that a matana al manas lahachzir works by the daled minim is not an invention of the Mechaber. It's not an invention of the Rishonim. It's a Beferish Gemara, I think it's on Mem Aleph Amud Beis in Sukkah, where there's a story of Rabbi Gamliel and 2 other Tanoim, believe it's Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Eliezer, that were on a sfina, they were on a ship, and it says that that Rabbi Gamliel bought a set of daled minim for 11 zuz, for 1,000 zuz. And the Gemara says, Hakamash Balon, that the chavivus of the mitzvah was so incredible to Rabbi Gamliel, he spent 1,000 zuz, a vast sum of money. He spent a fortune on the set of daled minim, but he was the only one who had daled minim. The other Tanoim didn't have daled minim. And it says that Rabbi Gamliel gave it to the other Tanoim in a matana al manas lahachzir, so that they should be able to be yaitza. So the concept that a matana al manas lahachzir works is to be found in the Gemara. It's not an invention of the Mechaber of the Rishonim. And now the Bir Halacha brings down a Rashbam from Baba Basra, where the Rashbam says, "V'ayin sham b'pirish Rashbam ilmavur da'afim einay noister loy l'shum davar." Even if the way the matana is given with the following extremely limiting stipulation. It's not, I'm not giving it to you for any other purpose. You have no ownership in these daled minim other than rak lotzeis by yedei mitzvah sachag. I'm giving you these daled minim with a matana amana haslachzer for one purpose and one purpose only. It's yours for the sake of you being able to be mekayim the mitzvah. It's lochem, so that you should be able to be mekayim the mitzvah of daled minim. But you cannot do anything else with it. Gam kein mikri nesina. That is also a valid nesina, keven shehu shaloi ledavar zeh. Because the bottom line is you gave it to the recipient with enough ownership, you made it lochem, so that he should be able to be mekayim the mitzvah, and that's all that you need. Now, obviously, this is a sugya that we could spend a tremendous amount of time on. If we were learning Masechta Sukkah Be'iyun, we would go through all of the Rishonim over here and be medayik in the words of the Rishonim, but that's not what we're doing. That's beyond the scope of this shiur. But what we see so far is like this. We see if you make a limitation, like we saw yesterday, if you make a limitation in the gift where it's only a matana l'shah, it's only a temporary matana. A matana l'shah is not a valid matana, and the recipient cannot be mekayim the mitzvah of daled minim because they're not considered lochem. But if you make a limitation in the gift as to what the recipient can use the daled minim for, that we see is not a chesaron in lochem. As long as he has the full unfettered capacity to use them to be mekayim the mitzvah of daled minim, and not as a loan, but as a matana, they're his, he fulfills lachem, and he's mekayim the mitzvah. Okay, now we go to Sif A. And if you think we're getting any easier, or any less fascinating, we're not. Let's go to Sif A. Nisanoi loy stam. Okay, Reuven and Shimon are in shul. Shimon says to Reuven, I don't have daled minim. Can I possibly use your daled minim to be yaitz of the mitzvah? It's on the first day of Yom Tov. And Reuven says, sure, no problem. Nisanoi loy stam. He gives him the daled minim without any stipulations. He doesn't say that it's a matana amanas lachzir. He just gives it to him. He says, sure, here it is. Go ahead. Nisanoi loy stam. Says the Mechaber, Hevi ki ilu amraloi almanas shetachzireu li. The Tanai that is a matana amanas lahachzir is assumed to be in place. We take that as a default. That's an umdana. We assume that the Tanai of amanas lahachzir was in place. Now, we have to realize when we learn this sif in the Mechaber, that the Mechaber is talking sort of from the perspective of the recipient. What do I mean by that? Reuven gave the daled minim to Shimon. Says the Mechaber, Reuven gave it to Shimon stam, the Tanai of a matana amanas lahachzir, even though it was unspoken, is assumed to be in place. And therefore, says the Mechaber, I'm going to skip a few words. Therefore, says the Mechaber, on the next line, in the middle of the line, V'im loy hechziroi lo yotza. And therefore, if Shimon does not return them, then it turns out that Shimon was never yotza because the matana was never a matana. So what's the Mechaber telling me here? The Mechaber is addressing the following point. Reuven gave the daled minim to Shimon. Now, what's unspoken in the Mechaber over here is that there is an assumption that when Reuven gave the daled minim to Shimon, he gave them to Shimon in a manner that Shimon will be able to be yaitz of the mitzvah. And on the first day of Yom Tov, that means that he gave it to Shimon in a way that Shimon will be able to be mekayim lochem. That means that Reuven gave it to Shimon as a real matana. He didn't give it to him as a loan, because if he would have given them to Shimon as a loan, Shimon would not be able to be yaitz of the mitzvah. So there's an unspoken assumption over here in the Mechaber. Now, we could declare why the Mechaber doesn't say this. That's a very interesting question to me right now, why the Mechaber did not say this. But the Mechaber didn't say it. The clear assumption of the Mechaber is, when Reuven gave the Daled Minim to Shimon, he certainly gave them to Shimon as a matana, so that Shimon will be able to be Yotze the mitzvah. Because if he gave it to him as a loan, then Shimon can't be Mekayim the mitzvah because it's not lachem. But now there's a separate question. Very nice, we're assuming that Reuven gave them to Shimon as a matana. Does Shimon have to give them back? Reuven never said it was a matana amanas lahachzer, and it was a real matana. So maybe Shimon could keep them. Maybe it was a gift. Shimon doesn't have to give them back. That's what the Mechaber is addressing, and the Mechaber is saying, no, that's also assumed. It's assumed that Reuven gave it to Shimon as a real gift, but it's also assumed that it was a matana amanas lahachzer. And the Mechaber addresses why we make the second assumption. He does not address why we make the first assumption, but he addresses why we make the second assumption. Let's see now verbatim what the Mechaber says inside. Let's read again from the beginning of Sif Hey and read all the words of the Mechaber. Nisan Eloi Stam. Reuven gave the Daled Minim to Shimon Stam, without any stipulations. Hevi ki'ilu amar loy amanasha tatsireuli. The stipulation of amanas lahachzir is as if it was spoken out. Why? Because he couldn't have given it to him as a real gift without a stipulation of amanas lahachzir. You know why, says the Mechaber? We assume that that's why he gave it to him. Why? Because what do you mean? Reuven also has to be Yotze the mitzvah. This is his only set of Daled Minim. So you can't think that Reuven gave them to Shimon as a complete matana without any stipulation of amanas lahachzir. Reuven also has to be Mekayim the mitzvah. And therefore, ve'im loy hechziroi lo yotza. And therefore, the Tanai of amanas lahachzir is assumed to be in place. And therefore, if Shimon does not return the Daled Minim to Reuven, it turns out that the matana was never a matana, and therefore Shimon was not Yotze. So again, the piece that I want to point out to you is that there's a double assumption going on over here. One assumption is that Reuven definitely gave the Daled Minim to Shimon as a gift. He didn't give it to him as a loan, right? Because if he gave it to him as a loan, Shimon can't be Yotze the mitzvah. And the Mechaber over here does not address that. He doesn't mention that. He doesn't say, Nisana loy stam, it's definitely a matana, and Shimon is definitely Yotze the mitzvah, but you should know it's also, second assumption, a matana amanas lahachzir, and Shimon has to give it back. So that first assumption is not addressed by the Mechaber. It's only the second assumption, that it was a matana, but it was a matana amanas lahachzir. That the Mechaber addresses. And he says, how do we know it was a matana amanas lahachzir? Because what do you mean? Reuven also needs to be Yotze the mitzvah, so he needs to get it back. What if Reuven was already Mekayim the mitzvah? Maybe Shimon saw Reuven. Reuven picked up his Daled Minim with the Esrog upside down. He made a bracha, he made a shechiyanu, he made the nanuim. Now Shimon went and asked for it, and now Reuven gave it to Shimon. So who says it's a matana amanas lahachzir? Now Reuven was already Yotze the mitzvah. He needs this for the rest of Yom Tov. Yeah, but for the rest of Yom Tov, he doesn't need lachem. So for the rest of Yom Tov, it's enough for Shimon to lend them to Reuven. You don't have to give it back to Reuven. So how do you know it's a matana amanas lahachzir? Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Yud Ches. Nisana loy stam. Reuven gave them to Shimon stam without any stipulation. We assume it was a matana amanas lahachzir. Why? Because Reuven needs to get it back to be Yotze the mitzvah on the first day. Ritzayna Larma says the Chavetz Chaim. What the Mechaber wants to say over here is Beheichi she'ein lo rak esrig zeh. When Reuven only has one set of Daled Minim, afilu noisle b'stam, so then even if Reuven gives it to Shimon without any stipulation, gamkein unduna demuchachu, it's still a forced assumption. It's an umduna. An umduna is an assumption. Demuchach, it's forced. It has to be that way. Shaloi kiven lite lo lachalutin, that Reuven certainly did not want to give it to Shimon outright, so that it should belong to Shimon forever. Lachalutin, forever. Ela amanashi yaseloi. Clearly, it was only a matana amanas lahachzir, because Reuven needs to get it back to be Yotze the mitzvah. Va'afilu im ba'oisei hayom kvar yotza ba'atzmai. And even if Ruvain was already mekayim the mitzvah on the first day, v'hu tzarech lo rak l'shayim echad, so that now he only needs it back for the rest of Yom Tov. He doesn't need it for the first day. Ubishara yomim alo yochel losis b'sho'ol, and for the rest of Yom Tov he could use a borrowed one. So Shimon doesn't necessarily have to give it back to Ruvain. He can lend it back. Nevertheless, we still evaluate and assume that the das of the noised, the das of Ruvain, the giver, is that even for the rest of Yom Tov, he doesn't want to use borrowed daled minim. He wants to use his daled minim. The umdani is that Ruvain, even if he was yotzei the mitzvah already on the first day, he certainly didn't mean to give away his lulav and esrog. And he certainly meant that the daled minim should come back to him and he should own them as he originally did. Okay. Now we have a very fascinating Ramah that's also based on a rush. And it's such an interesting Ramah because when you first hear the words of the Ramah, I think just about everybody's going to say, well, yeah, that makes sense. And then we'll point out the bomb kasha on the Ramah. Says the Ramah, Hago. Okay. Ruvain had daled minim, Shimon did not have daled minim. Ruvain gave daled minim to Shimon as a matana amanas lahachzir. Matana amanas lahachzir is effective. So Shimon could take them, be behind the mitzvah on the first day, and he could fulfill the requirement of lochem. Ultimately, Shimon has to give them back to Ruvain. Because if he does not give them back to Ruvain, then the original matana was not a matana, because it was a matana that was conditional. And if the original matana was not a matana, then Shimon wasn't yotzei the mitzvah, because it wasn't lochem. So ultimately, he has to give them back. Says the Ramah, he has to give them back. How does he have to give them back? Says the Ramah, V'tzarich lachzor v'litnai leba'olav b'matana. When Shimon gives the daled minim back to Ruvain, he has to give them back as a real matana. Not that I'm returning a loan, right? I received it. Shimon received them from Ruvain as a matana. And as long as Shimon had them, they were totally his. He was mekayim lochem with them. Now when he gives them back to Ruvain, he has to make a real chazara. He has to give them back as a matana. He has to give them back to Ruvain. Here's a gift. Now they're yours. Says the Ramah, why? Kidei sheyiyah shel bailim, so that they should now once again belong to the original bailim, belong to Ruvain. Now, notice that the word bailim is lashon rabim. Okay, that's critical. Kidei sheyiyah shel bailim, so that it should belong to the original owner. So when we speak about the original owner, we call him bailim, lashon rabim. V'yetzu boy. The word v'yetzu is also lashon rabim. So what the Ramah is saying is, Shimon has to give back the daled minim to Ruvain as a real matana. Why? So that Ruvain can now use the daled minim to be yotzei the mitzvah on the first day of Yom Tov, and they should be lochem. They should belong to him. And he brings this down from the Rosh and from the Rabbeinu Yerucham. Now, at first glance, this seems to make perfect sense. Let's go back to our case, okay? Ruvain, Shimon. Ruvain has daled minim, Shimon does not. Shimon wants to daven at the Hashkama minyan at 6:15. Ruvain's davening at the 8:30 minyan. Shimon asks Ruvain, can I use your daled minim? Ruvain says, sure, no problem. Here is my daled minim as a matana al manas lahachzir. Oh, great, beautiful. Shimon davens at the Hashkama minyan. He makes a bracha, shechiyanu, he makes tanuim, he uses them by halal. Al's ding, he was b'kaim lochem, he was b'kaim everything, he was b'kaim the mitzvah. He's happy as a lark. And now he wants to make sure that he's b'kaim the tanai, so that the original gift was a good gift, so he was b'kaim lachem. So he goes back to Ruvain and he gives the daled minim back to Ruvain. Says the Ramah in the name of the Rosh, when he gives them back, he has to make sure that he gives it back with a real matana. Why? Because let's say he didn't give it back as a real matana. Let's say he just gave it to Ruvain. They're mine, I'm lending them to you. Well, then Ruvain comes to the 8:30 minyan, and he can't be yotzei the mitzvah, because it's not lachem, it's not his. So the Ramah says, hey Shimon, You better give him back to Ruvain with a real chazara. Because if not, Ruvain can't be yotzei the mitzvah. Now again, at face value, this sounds like it makes sense. Because Ruvain also has a chiyuv lachem. And Ruvain gave away his daled minim to Shimon. Now Shimon was a good boy, and Shimon was mekayim the Tanai to go give them back. But if he doesn't give it back as a real matana, then it's not Ruvain's. Then Ruvain can't be mekayim lachem. He's not yotzei the mitzvah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Ruvain is mekayim the mitzvah mimanavshach. If Shimon gives it back to him as a real matana, beautiful. Then we don't have to get lamdush. Everything is fine. They belonged to Shimon while Shimon had the matana. Shimon gave it back to Ruvain as a matana gemura. Now it's Ruvain's. No problem. We don't even have to think about it. Everything's perfect. We don't see any room for a question. Let's say Shimon did not give it back to Ruvain as a real matana. Let's say Shimon was some kind of wise guy. And he said, oh, Ruvain, you don't have daled minim for the 830 minion? I'll give you a loan. I have this beautiful set of daled minim. Here's a loan. Okay. Was Shimon mekayim the stipulation? Was Shimon mekayim the Tanai? It was a matana manas lahachzir. He didn't make a chazara. If he didn't make a chazara, then he wasn't mekayim the Tanai. If he wasn't mekayim the Tanai, then the original gift was never a gift. If the original gift was never a gift, then guess what? Ruvain never gave them away. So Ruvain's mekayim the mitzvah at the 830 minion. They're his. So it seems to be a bomb kasha on the Ramah. The Ramah seems to be saying that Shimon has to make sure to give them back with a matana gemura to protect who? To protect Ruvain. Asks the Mishnah Berurah, what are you talking about? It's not Ruvain that you need to protect. Ruvain is going to be mekayim the mitzvah mimanavshach. It's Shimon that you have to protect. Shimon is the one that has to make sure that he gives it back with a matana gemura, because if he doesn't give it back as a matana gemura, then he wasn't mekayim the Tanai. The Tanai was a matana amanas lehachzir, not a matana amanas lish oil. It's a matana amanas lehachzir. If you didn't make a chazara, you weren't mekayim the Tanai. If you weren't mekayim the Tanai, then the original matana was never a matana. If the original matana was never a matana, then Shimon was never yotzei the mitzvah, and the daled minim never left the ownership of Ruvain. So Ruvain's always mekayim the mitzvah. It's Shimon that you have to protect. Let's see it inside in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Yud Tes, V'tzarech lachzer v'litnoi. First of all, says the Mishnah Berurah, you should realize that this Ramah is not going back only on the beginning of Sif Hey, where the Tanai, where the gift was given stam, without any spoken stipulations. This Ramah is going back on everything we learned until now about a matana manas lahachzir. Koya kol hanal gam b'sif daled. This goes back on Sif daled, Sif Hey, everything that we've spoken about the case of a matana manas lahachzir. When the recipient gives it back, he has to give it back as a real matana. V'atam, and the reason is the kol shenisano loy harehu shaloi legamri. The reason he has to give it back with matana is because as long as Shimon had it mitaras matana. Ruvain gave it to him as a real matana. V'amanas lahachzir to ka'amar. And when Ruvain said that he's giving it with a matana, amanas lahachzir, k'moshe omer amanasha tachzar v'titei li b'matana. That means you have to make a real chazara. You have to really give it back to me with a matana. Ois katnachaf, kedei shiur shal bailu v'yetzu bai. Says the Mishnah Berurah, halosha megumgum. Doesn't make sense. This lashon doesn't make sense, what the Ramah wrote. And the critical problem over here in the language of the Ramah is the word v'yetzu boy. Because v'yetzu is lashon rabim. It goes back on ba'olim. It seems from the way that the Ramah wrote it that the Ramah is trying to protect Ruvain. The Mishnah Berurah, it's not Ruvain who needs protection, it's Shimon who needs protection. Halosha v'gumgum, the mashma mizeh, because the implication of the Ramah is the imlo yachzer v'yitel lahabaylim b'matana gemura, that if Shimon does not turn around and give the daled minim back to Ruvain with a matana gemura, lo yuchlu abaylim lotzei sidei chayvasam be'esrik, that somehow Ruvain's not going to be yotzei the mitzvah. Says the Chavetz Chaim Kuf Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph v'lechare ain't kain. That's not true. The habaylim b'chol gavni yuchlu lotzeis. The baylim are going to be yotzei the mitzvah mimanavshach. Shaharei Nastu Rak Amanashe Achziru Lehem B'Matana Kadin. Because it was a Matana Amanas Lahachzir, which means that Shimon has to make a bona fide Chazara. He has to give it back with a Matana. And if he does not return the Dalaminim in that manner, then Ruvain's original Matana to Shimon is bottled. And it's as if Ruvain never gave them to Shimon. And it's Shimon who's not Yotzei the mitzvah. But Ruvain will be Yotzei the mitzvah, v'tzarchiyin. And the Chavetz Chaim throws up his hands. He says, tzarchiyin on the Ramah. I don't know what the Ramah is saying. Now, the Chavetz Chaim has a fascinating teretz to the kasha on Kuf Lamed Amid Beis in Sharetzion Ois Katan Chavhei, which is a very lengthy Sharetzion that I'm not going to read through. But I'll tell you what his teretz is. And his teretz works very, very well in the case that I gave you. The case that I gave you is like this. Ruvain, Shimon. Ruvain has Dalaminim. Shimon doesn't. Shimon wants to daven by the Hashkama minyan. Ruvain wants to daven by the 8:30 minyan. Okay, so now let's analyze what's going to happen. Ruvain gives the Dalaminim with a Matana Amanas Lahachzir to Shimon. Shimon uses the Dalaminim at the Hashkama minyan. So he's saying Hallel at 7 o'clock. He makes the bracha, he makes the shechianu, makes the nanuim, says Hallel, does a shanis, al's ding, everything is beautiful. He was b'kaim lochem because he had these Dalaminim as a Matana Amanas Lahachzir. Now, the fact that he got it as a Matana Amanas Lahachzir requires him to make a bona fide Chazara to Ruvain. We saw in yesterday's shiur, when does he have to make that Chazara? He has to make that Chazara with enough time for the original owner, for the Noisen, to be able to be Mekayim the mitzvah on the first day of Yom Tov. Now, how long does Ruvain have to be Mekayim the mitzvah? He has until a few minutes before Shkia. Once we hit Shkia, we hit Ben Hashmashas, now ready to Sveika. So he has till a few minutes before Shkia to be Mekayim the mitzvah. Now, what happens if after the Hashkama minyan, Shimon does not give them to Ruvain with a Matana Gemura? Right? So we said, no problem, Ruvain is going to be Yotzei the mitzvah Mimarashach. Why? Because if Shimon gave it back to Ruvain with a Matana Gemura, everything's fine. If Shimon did not give them back to Ruvain with a Matana Gemura, then Shimon was not Mekayim the stip. He wasn't Mekayim the stipulation. He wasn't Mekayim it because he didn't make a real Chazara. If he didn't make a real Chazara, then Ruvain's gift to Shimon was never a gift. Ruvain never gave them away, and everything is fine. So the way we asked the kasha, we said it would seem that by the 8:30 minyan, Ruvain is going to be Mekayim the mitzvah Mimanavshach. If Shimon gave them back to him with a real gift, everything is fine. If Shimon did not give it back to Ruvain with a real gift, Ruvain is still Yotzei the mitzvah because it means Shimon was never Mekayim the Tanai and Ruvain's gift to Shimon was never a gift. But that's not really true because Shimon does not have to return them to Ruvain in time for the 8:30 minyan. Shimon has all the way until 10 minutes before Shkia. I'm saying 10 minutes. He has all the way up to the end of the day to give them back to Shimon as long as Ruvain has enough time to be Mekayim the mitzvah. So it could be that if if Shimon would not give them back to Ruvain with a Matana Gemura, then Ruvain would not be able to be Mekayim the mitzvah at the 8:30 minyan because the Memanashach doesn't work. If Shimon gave them back to Ruvain, but it wasn't a Matana Gemura, you can't say that nullifies Ruvain's original Matana to Shimon, because Shimon still has hours and hours and hours left in the day to make a proper Chazara to Ruvain. So the Chavetz Chaim in the Sharetzion suggests that might be a teretz to his kasha on the Ramah. The problem is that there's another hole in that teretz, and that is that if Shimon knows that Ruvain wants to daven at the 8:30 minyan, and he needs the daled minyan for the 8:30 minyan, that's also an umdana demukach. That's also an umdana that he had to give it back to him in time for the 8:30 minyan. And if he doesn't give it back to him in time for the 830 minyan, that Pashtus, according to the Paiskim, Shimon wasn't Yotze the mitzvah when he used Ruvain's Talad Minim, because it was implicit in the das of Ruvain that he wants it back for the 830 minyan. Also, this whole halacha of the Ramah is based on the Rush. And if you look in the Rush does not say what the Ramah says. The Rush does not say that Shimon has to give it back to Ruvain with a matana, otherwise Ruvain won't be able to be Yotze the mitzvah. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, like the Ramah says, Kidei sheyeh shel bailim v'yetzu bay. All the Ramah says, all the Rush says is, V'tzarich lachzar v'litnoi lo ba'alav b'matana. The Rush says when Shimon gives it back to Ruvain, he has to give it back as a matana. And everybody agrees to that. Because, again, everybody agrees that Ruvain gave it to Shimon as a matana amanas lachzir, which means that it belonged to Shimon as long as Shimon had it. And in order for Shimon to be Mekayim the Tanai, he's got to give it back to Ruvain. He has to make a real chazara. If he doesn't make a real chazara, he didn't give it back. If he didn't give it back, he wasn't Mekayim the Tanai. And then he wasn't Yotze the mitzvah. But the Rush doesn't say anything about protecting Ruvain. The Rush only talks about protecting Shimon, not protecting Ruvain. So where did the Ramah get that it was here to protect Ruvain? The answer may be that there's a Toyas Atfus here in the Ramah. And it's not supposed to say V'yetzu bay. It's supposed to say V'yotze bay in the singular. See, if it would say V'yotze bay, then indeed it's protecting Shimon. It's not protecting Ruvain. And in the Darkei Moshe, in the Ramah on the Torah, the Ramah on the Torah does not say V'yetzu bay. So it's very possible that this is just a Toyas Atfus in the Ramah. In any case, you see the tremendous lumdus that's going on over here. All right, do we have time to go a little bit weiter? Not really. The truth is, this is a good break point, and Kuf Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph is tomorrow's daf in the Dirshu, so it's a safe place to stop. Baruch Hashem, we're back on schedule. So, all right, we'll stop over here. And thank you so much for joining me for delicious limud HaTorah. The schos of limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shem should send Yeshua's refuahs, parnasim, sheduchim to all those in need. We should all be zeichet together to see the B'yeskel Tzedek. B'meher of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.